everybody. Welcome to another episode of Outer Sounds. We're here today with Tim Story, and we have selected the reissue of his album Threads for the April selection. And, we're excited to talk to him about that record and about his music and everything else. How you doing, Tim?
Great. Thanks so much for having me, Greg. This is exciting. I'm glad that you enjoyed Threads too. I hope everybody else will.
Yeah, it's a fantastic record, and I have a lot of questions about it, but basically, I just wanted to know, it kind of technically your first record, but it never really came out, and but how did you put it together? What kind of equipment were you using? And I know you were pretty young when you made it as well, right?
Yeah. I was in my early 20s. I was always self-taught in music, and I got a record store job when I was 16 after my first job of bagging groceries. I got a record store job, and the manager of this little, mall store in Toledo, Ohio, he happened to be John Thompson, who went on to be a real centerpiece for the burgeoning scene in Cleveland with Per Ubu and Devo. And he and I just ravenously listened to the craziest stuff we could find, a lot of the imports that were coming out of Germany. So I had a lot of, I grew up in the Midwest in Toledo, and it was all, Aerosmith and Bob Seger and all that kind of stuff. But I quickly developed a taste for really different styles of music. And I realized there was a whole world of stuff out there. So I began, I started off a college career in chemical engineering. I had always done well at math and science, but my heart just wasn't really into it. And I came back after a year and continued working at the record store while I finished up college in something else that I equally didn't use. It was just a great time in music technology. That was the beginning of these 4-track recorders that you could actually afford, that you could overlay sound, so you could actually compose with them. Really, you could work out a composition in your head and then record them track by track. So that's really Threads. I made in my parents' basement. Nice. I saved up from my record store job and got one of these Tascam 4-track recorders. And I found a guitar, a Les Paul, real beat up one in a pawn shop, and a yard sale vibraphone, and some effects that I found, and kitchen utensils, whatever I could make noise with. And I worked for a long time. I really worked down there for a number of years, and it was everything was oh man, this is really crappy. This is, I would never show this to anybody. But eventually I ended up with about 45 minutes of material that I finally wasn't embarrassed about. And I thought, this stuff is pretty good. So I sent them out to some fairly random 6 cassettes. I made cassettes and sent them out mostly to European labels because it seemed like it would be the best fit at the time. I sent a cassette to Klaus Schultz. I sent a cassette to Adam Records, who eventually decided to release it, but through another bunch of crazy circumstances, they went out of business after I think I got a couple of test pressings. And they went out of business right before. They had great bands like Art Zoid and Universe Zero, who I was super excited to be on the same label as them. But they wanted to branch out. Gerard Noyen wanted to branch out into this more. There was no real ambient music at the time, but that kind of stuff. I think he was kind of patterning his label on the old Eno's Obscure label, that kind of thing. But so it didn't come out. And that was after a year or so of this was, I was probably 23 or something. And I'd been working on this material since, maybe I was 20 to 23.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
it by the time it didn't get released, I had already finished up what would become the first real release that came out in another country.
Yeah. Yeah.
And these guys introduced me to this label in Norway and blah, blah, blah. But Threads was really the first record, and it was really, you know, forgotten pretty
Yeah.
much
Right.
after that.
Yeah. I saw, you know, I noticed that like it was like first officially released on CD like in 1992. So almost like 10 years later. And then this is the first like vinyl issue of it, right?
Yeah. Archie Patterson of Urok released a very small edition of it in 92, as you said. But I'm particularly proud of this release because it is the first, I mean, from the time I got these test pressings, it's the first time in 40 years that I actually held a new vinyl version of it. So it was pretty exciting. And the guys at Dias, Ryan and Gibby, were fantastic. I mean, they really took a lot of care with it. So we spent a year. I dug through all my old letters and found notes of mixing notes for the thing. And we picked out some new cover art, since there was never really original cover art for it from that period. But it was great working with them because they were really excited about the process too. So we all put a lot of time into really, I dug up old photos and tried to recreate the history of it and everything. So it was a lot of fun to put it together.
Yeah, they did a great job with it. And I think it sounds and looks great. And it's just probably feels good for you to have it like
it does. And
out
it's
in the
funny,
world,
we've been getting reviews and stuff, and it, you know, about this great lost work and everything. And I always just considered it, it's this old record that but it has gotten some attention, which is great. I mean, it's you know, people I think appreciated where it fit into the history of things, because they're before that there weren't a lot of opportunity for like bedroom musicians like me to make electronic music, because it took going into an expensive studio that had these big multi-track recorders. So, you know, I feel now that it's kind of a kinship with, you know, the whole 90s Aphex Twin and all these guys that were just literally making music in their bedrooms. And, you know, I was, of course, doing it out of necessity 40 years ago. So,
yeah, I hear it. You know, I mean, I think I mentioned in my email, I definitely hear it like it's like the American version of some of the German music that was happening, you know, Cluster and Rodelius and, you know, some of Eno stuff or whatever. And also, do you know Carrie Limer's music?
I do, and
some similar things at that time too.
I knew of him at the time, and it was only later that I listened to his music well after I had recorded those things. But there is definitely, you know, a connection with that kind of stuff. And I was clearly, I mean, I was listening to all kinds of stuff, you know, the Mahavishnu Orchestra and Bartok and all this stuff. But there was a real special place for these personal records that were being made on homemade equipment by, you know, in Germany by you know, people like Cluster and Robert Wyatt was a rock bottom to me. Was like, it was like, wow, you can make these personal little records that don't have to appeal to some big imagined, you know, rock audience or something. So it was really inspiring to me. A lot of that music that was just kind of being made by the seat of these guys' pants in a way.
Yeah, it's exciting. You can, you know, like you said, you spent 3 years working on it. You could never do that in a professional studio. It'd cost $1 million.
Exactly. And I mean, that was part of it. I was so shy about it. I mean, my brother was had a formal training and went on to be a big arranger and writer of marching band music. And he was, you know, super popular in high school and was writing stuff for them. And I didn't take a single music class because the stuff I was interested in, that just wasn't it. I wasn't in the choir. I wasn't in the band, because that wasn't the music that got me excited. So I was always like very insecure and kind of secretive about the music, because I'm a guy making this weird stuff in the Midwest, which was not a premier place for it. So I felt kind of alone in doing it, but I think that's what makes it special to me now, is that sort of that dedication and love of that stuff, and not really sharing it with anybody. It was just it was a very kind of intensive personal experience, which was really good for me, in a way.
Comes from like a real, like you said, like a youthful, spontaneous place, which is really
exactly.
Sometimes like you can't,
for sure.
You wish you could like recapture that, but it's just like a special time in your life, but
and I listened. It was fun. I hadn't listened to it for a long time, but being able to revisit the masters and remastering it and stuff, it's like, oh yeah, that was cool. That was kind of a nice sound I got there. And tape loops became a big part of that record. And that again was just sort of inventing. I knew that people were doing it. I didn't know exactly how, but I figured I'd put little pencils around the room and run the tape through and into a different recorder. And all of a sudden it was like, wow, this has such potential. It was so many discoveries at that point, and it really was kind of special going back and listening to that, because there's always stuff when you go back to your old stuff and you go, wow, I would do that differently, or man, that's really embarrassing. But there wasn't, for that being my first record, there wasn't an awful lot in it that was really embarrassing, which I felt was kind of to me, that was a personal achievement. That it was like, oh God, this is horrible. I can't stand to listen to this. But it was fun.
It definitely holds up. Yeah, it holds up, and it sounds, it sounds like, it sounds of like some of that music we mentioned of the time, but then that music in particular is also seems relevant again, or maybe has always been relevant. I don't know, but
I know what you mean. I think there was a whole time when that was a little bit forgotten a little bit, and then people rediscovered like analog, and then this whole bunch of artists, Julian Cope and all these electronic musicians in the 90s that were like name checking these guys, like, oh man, if you like my stuff, you got to hear what people were doing 20 and 30 years ago. So I think well deserved. I mean, I think that stuff, those records really, really do stand the best of them stand the test of time so well. And it's hard to imagine how new they were at the time to be able to still feel that fresh today.
Right. Yeah. So then you said that, your first like official record came out, you were working on that basically after Threads got shelved, and then that came out, maybe a couple of years or a year later. But it's interesting because Threads is very, has like, it's very repetitive, and it's got, a lot of synths and, like you said, loops, and it seems like there's a little more like experimentation going on. And then your first album seems a little more like composerly, or has a more of like a romantic kind of feeling, for lack of a better term. It seems stylistically like pretty.
It was. I learned a lot. I mean, I think some of the shorter piano-based pieces and Threads were sort of,
we're in that direction
with a little premonition of where that would go. It was, that was a time of really kind of figuring out what I wanted to do, and I'd find little niches and I would explore those. But I agree with you. I think there's a lot on Threads that didn't really get explored till later in some ways, in the last 10 years of more experimentation. I was really obsessed for a while with this melding of electronics and orchestral instruments. I thought that there was this place for, very composed, like almost neoclassic things, but with sounds that people couldn't really distinguish if they were,
Right.
and hopefully wouldn't care if they were like acoustic or electronic. It was a time of really exploring, trying to create really organic electronic sounds. I mean, I remember, you know, the early Tomita and Wendy Walter Carlos records, that it just seems so crazy to me that here you have this brand new instrument that can do anything, and all you want to do is try to make it sound like these other classical instruments. So to me, I thought there's a new kind of classical music that you can make with this without having these instruments copy something, using them for texture and interesting things that they are unique at, instead of, it's sort of like inventing a tuba and trying to make it sound like a piano, because the piano is the only thing that you think of as a musical instrument. So so yeah, I went down that path for quite a while, and you know, eventually I got to the point where I really felt like I had, you know, sort of captured what I wanted to with that. And then I got restless, as I usually do, and moved on. But I think there is I think now there's a little bit of liberation in trying new things that kind of harkens back to Threads in a way, that sort of just wild, hey, let's just throw this in and see if it works. And if it does, and, you know, again, being able to work now, not on a 4-track machine, but with digital workstations on a computer, I have this great freedom to create a lot of things, sounds and composition techniques that I couldn't have really done before, you know, with just linear tape.
Yeah, for sure. It's amazing. Like the possibilities are endless, but then that almost becomes a little daunting. Sometimes it's nice to have, you know, limitations or, you know, a few things.
That's a great point, because I think some of the best things about those early records, especially Threads, is working within those limitations. I don't know what I would do if I was starting now. I mean, if I had 256 tracks to work with, everybody now, it's like, well, if this track isn't good, I'll just add some stuff to it and it'll make it better. Back then it was like, all right, I got 4 tracks. If this piece isn't great, there's no amount of adding 2 or 3 tracks that's going to make it great. So it did really teach me discipline, for sure, that, you know, it's like, okay, if this is not coming together from the very beginning, I'm going to scrap it, because you know, the limitations of the equipment really forces you to have some discipline. So
so how did you after your first album came out, you actually put a record out on like a major label, right? Polydor.
One of the first records on Uniton. So one of the other crazy stories about Threads was the cassette that I sent to Klaus Schultze. He actually wrote back this nice letter. It was a refusal. He didn't have a label, but he liked it, and he said, I'll play it off. And it turned out he gave this to his engineer, who also liked it and would play it in his car in Berlin. And these two visiting, a British and a German, very young journalists came and visited him. And this guy played this random cassette that there were 6 of in the world for these 2 guys. And they're the ones that reached out to me and said, hey, we like this. Are you doing anything with it? We know this new label in Norway. So this Norwegian label, Uniton, which became really the first label that actually did release my work. The second and third album on there attracted the attention of Polygram in Japan, which to me was like, oh my God, this is spectacular. Here, this tiny little label in Norway, and somehow they heard it over there. So yeah, those 2 records were pressed on in vinyl and CD, the first CDs of my career in Japan, which was pretty cool for, you know, a guy that was used to obscurity.
And then you worked with, you worked with a bunch of different labels, but notably Windham Hill in the 80s, and then Hearts of Space, which is like an important, like California West Coast institution for space music and ambient music. How was it
Yeah,
working with those two different labels?
yeah, those also kind of came about from I hadn't had, I mean, I was like 7 or 8 years into my so-called career
Yeah, yeah.
before I ever had a release in the US. So
Okay.
but somehow I think it might have been through George Winston, maybe one of the piano pieces came to his attention. He gave it to Will Ackerman, and Will put this Uniton track on one of his piano samplers, and he just casually said, "Hey, if you ever have anything that we might like, send it." So after the fourth album with Uniton, Wheat and Rust, I had this new material which would later become Glass Green, that I was really excited about. And I thought they were expanding into some interesting areas. Will was restless too. And I think he was a little frustrated with the whole sort of new age thing, which his label spawned a little, but he was really stretching out with the Wim Mertens, a minimalist Dutch composer. And I thought, hey, I know it's all electronic, but it's got a certain appeal to it that maybe, and I sent it to him, and he liked it. He wrote back, and we started working. I had about 5 or 6 tracks done, and I finished it up, and he released it. And thankfully, it was just a year or two before he quit. I think he got a little fed up with the whole thing, and he sold Windham Hill to BMG, and I was promptly dropped.
So you were right there at that transition.
Yeah, I was there when he was really open to that kind of stuff, and then it became a label of pretty, not my kind of music after that.
Right. Same here. Yeah. Glass Green. I really like Glass Green. I was listening to that recently as well. I was trying to listen to some of your discography, not all of it, because there's like a lot of records, but
there are.
I tried to dip into some different ones. Excuse me. But yeah, that one's interesting. I really like it, and it's like you said, it's kind of unique in the Windham Hill catalog in a way. So because it's
I was happy to have that opportunity, and I still like that record too. There's a certain austerity to the composition, and I there's no piano on it for the first time in a while. I just I was developing these little sort of electronic tone poems. So that was an important record, both of course for the exposure that it had, but also I think developmentally for me, I mean, it was an important step in some of the things I was trying and everything.
Yeah. And then so after that, that's when you connected with Hearts of Space, like in the early 90s.
Yeah, they contacted me after the Windham Hill thing. And I was a little, again, the music started before the whole like new age thing and everything. So I always felt kind of like my buddy Harold Budd, whose music also fit into that sort of tonal, quiet stuff. But it was not at all to me about fading into the background. It was they were quiet and they were tonal, but it was an attempt to hopefully get in and twist more complex feelings than that. So in the beginning, I was a little hesitant to sign on with a label that had a real identity like Hearts of Space, but they were big fans of the work and allowed me to do what I wanted. And so I think in some ways those were also important records for me. I was finally not too shy to ask some real musicians to play some of my compositions, and that turned out spectacularly for me. I had the benefit of a wonderful orchestra players, a cellist and an oboe player, which really allowed me, was becoming clear that I couldn't really get the kind of expression I wanted out of electronics. And I didn't want to fake, as I mentioned before, I didn't want to fake, trying to get some kind of acoustic sound. So it's like, right. So that was a big step. And I loved making those records. Those were sweet.
Yeah, it's like, if you want the sound of the oboe, you should probably just get the real thing.
Yeah. And no amount of twiddling with all the stuff gives you that the beautiful nuances and the right. real acoustic little anomalies and stuff that you get with real players and real instruments. And that was a lot of fun, because I really, aside from doing that, using these acoustic instruments, recognizable, I really was able to develop like a language for the electronics in those. I think still they have very unique sounds in them, from very careful working of the new sampling instruments that were coming out, and really stretching out the sound design part of it. So those felt to me like really integrated electroacoustic music in a way, and they were a lot of fun to make.
When you were working with instrumentalists like oboe or strings, like you said, since you don't have a musical training, you probably weren't writing like a score for them. Were you just playing piano? Or did you learn how to? Yeah,
it was a little bit of both, because they to get the quality of players that I needed, they weren't going to be casual players, and all of the really great players came from that orchestral, a very strict music theory background. So I often would write out they were very composed from beginning to end. All the notes that they played were composed, and it was a combination of writing out. I knew enough. I had some guitar lessons when I was a kid, and I knew enough to, how to do that. And they were very patient with me. But I think they were a little curious about what would happen. But I later found out that they were both, really happy about the work that we did together, which really made me feel good. I felt like, I'm asking these professionals to dive into this sort of unknown stuff, but they were really great. And if I had to write a big score or something, I would have either been unable, or it would have taken me a lot of time. But since I was writing these, single line parts for these guys, and then we would always talk out the compositions in the session to be like, all right, stretch that out a little bit, and they were great about accommodating my limited knowledge about that stuff.
So when did you start working with like computers, or like digital audio, and starting to get into like processing audio and manipulating things that way?
The very beginnings of that, as far as my discography, was the second of the Hearts of Space records, Perfect Flaw. Mm-hmm. And it just had a few very basic, like repeating, like I had a studio after I was signed to Windham Hill. I went in partnership with a guy that took care of the commercial part of the studio, and we had it. So I had access to some of the very beginning software, like Sound Tools. It was called before Pro Tools. But it only had 2 tracks and then 4 tracks. But the 4-track thing was again, it was like, wow, I can take this whole thing and start to manipulate it. But it wasn't really until Shadow Play that I really had access to, multi-track computer stuff. And that really opened up the ability to overlay acoustic instruments and stuff again, and in ways that I could do after recording the parts. It's like, oh, I could take this part and, you know, recycle it in here. So that was probably it. And that sort of kicked off a new phase of experimentation for me after Shadow Play. But that is organic as I think that album sounds. There's quite a bit of the beginnings of that kind of digital audio and manipulation, and of course diving into more sound design work as those plugins and stuff became available.
Yeah, that's same thing with me. Like I first started making music on a 4-track as well, like, you know, tape 4-track. And then I think it was in like, you know, the late 90s or mid to late 90s, there was a period of time where companies were allowed to make clones of Mac computers.
Yes.
So it was like a Mac clone.
The Power Tower Pro?
I don't remember what it was called.
I had one of those. Yeah.
They let them, you know, like use the operating system and, you know, license it to these companies. So I had a Mac clone in my dorm room at school, and I started
fantastic.
Like, oh, I can get sounds in the computer and start doing stuff, you know, and it was fascinating. And then
it is, and I know your career, you dove into that early and embraced that early, and I think, you know, to me it was, I'm sure to you too, it's sort of like the unimaginable was so at your fingertips.
Yeah. So like, you know, I want to talk about some of your recent work that you've been doing over the past, you know, whatever you could say, 7-10 years or something. But more specifically, I've been listening to you have a series of pieces called Smudges, or it's like a technique that you've been using. And I really like, you know, I like this process a lot because I've done some similar things. But yeah, tell me what you've been working on and like what you've been.
After Shadow Play years ago, I really got restless again and started making, you know, using a lot of different things. I released an album that I think confounded a lot of my older fans, called Buzzle. That was that just, you know, really used the computer, really used really, I think, unique sound design, and it's quite sort of busy and strange. The Smudges thing, I really I was working on some collaborations with Akim Rodelius of Cluster, and I was just playing around for my own amusement, really, and started making these little tone poems. And they're basically, for the you probably can figure out kind of how I made them, but I took little looped bits of existing audio, other people's music, and in fact, I used a lot of my brother's marching band pieces.
That's cool.
Because the woodwinds are never they're never perfectly in pitch with each other, and so they make this really organic, you know, sound. But basically, it's a program that takes little snapshots of audio, and that includes the timbre and the you know, the harmonies and everything. It just takes a moment, and it just holds that. It just smears it, smudges it over, you know, whatever time period that you want. I know people have made these, you know, slowed down versions of things, and they can be pretty fascinating. You know, these things that are slowed down 100 times, and they put a Justin Bieber song in it, and they turn into some, you know, totally different epic thing. But these were, I found that, like, if I just played a whole piece, like a whole 5-minute piece, and it froze something every 10 seconds, it would just cycle through so many random things that it didn't have any kind of internal, like, repetitiveness with changes that I like. So I would just take these small samples of existing audio, maybe 5 seconds of this rich, piece. And I would just loop that for say 10 minutes. And then I would set the cycle of this smudge making thing for something that was offset from that. So it was always choosing from a finite amount of audio so that it wouldn't just be some random crazy, oh my God, there's a whole new chord. It would slowly cycle through these beautiful patterns. And I just made them for my own pleasure, really. They were just fun. But Russ Curry of Curious Music, who I've been working with, he's got a very forward-looking label. His father died, and I said, I just sent him a bunch of these and said, hey, I said, when I just need a little space, I just put these on. I said, maybe you'll like these. And he loved them. He over a period of months, he mentioned to me, oh my God, I listened to these again. They're great. And finally he said, we got to release these because they're really nice. So it sort of came about just as something, I just experimented with this process and fed it different things until I really found what made me excited about it. I found the technique that I like to create these, and then the content, the actual stuff that I put in them. And then it just started, whenever I had a spare, half an hour when I just needed to clear my head, I would just go into this thing and like, all right, let's try this. And just a huge amount of trial and error of trying different things. And out of that came this batch of smudges, which I've now done 2 or 3 releases of, including the crazy version of Silent Night that I listened to some of that one. Well, there's got to be there's got to be some just out of love, really, just playing with sound. I'm glad you like them. They mean a lot to me. I think part of it is, when I make music, otherwise it's so like I spend a month on a single like 3-minute piece or something, and by the time it's done, I know it so well inside and out. I just need to put it away for a couple of years. But since the Smudges was more of a process, I didn't get sick of it, because they were almost, once I found this little bunch of parameters and I put it in there, it's like, wow, that's a surprise. I didn't know that this would be coming, but I like when this happens and everything. So it was a way to sort of release myself from this micromanaging kind of, which I am guilty of. It's nice when you can like set up a process and let it unfold by itself, and then you can spend more time just listening. Exactly. That's it, really, selecting, the parts that you like or you don't like. That's so true. And I think, it turned me into a listener instead of a creator. I created the parameters and the content, but what was spit out of this thing was just the curation of it. Wasn't in deciding what notes to play. It was in deciding which of these little self-contained things I liked. And you're right. It's sort of wonderful when you can just set up something that makes something that pleases you, and you don't have to, analyze every moment of it. It's sort of like, that's it. It turned me into a listener as much as a composer, really. So how did you link up with Rodelius? That's like, we're talking about 40 years ago, you listening to Cluster and being inspired, and now I still think that's crazy. I remember like as a kid holding Grosses Wasser by Cluster and like, who are these guys? And then to think that later that I would know both of them, become really dear friends with both of them, and have the opportunity to work with them often, is spectacular. I think Rodelius, I wrote to him after I'd done the first couple records. There was just something about his music. I never wrote fan letters to people or reached out, but there was just something so personal and nice about his records. I just felt comfortable writing him a letter at one point in the 80s. and he wrote back, and I sent him some music,
Oh, nice.
And we became friends. I traveled with them on their first tour of the U.S. That was also through Russ Curry. And I visited him in the mid '80s. When I quit my real job, my record store job, and decided to try to do music full time, I went over to Europe for 3 months and visited the label in Norway and journalists and different contacts. But he was one that I just said, "Hey, I'm going to be over here." He said, "Come and visit."
Oh, that's great.
So I did. I stopped there thinking I'd stay a day or two, and we ended up traveling together for like a week to the
awesome.
lakes in Austria, and we just became good friends. Anytime I was there, anytime he came to the U.S., they would just come over and spend a week with us if they were traveling here and everything. And then it was never about trying to hook up for music purposes. It was just this friendship that developed. And it was really only after 10 or 20 years that I was like, "Hey, you want to try some music together?"
I think yeah, that's great. It seems like it's a nice, almost like full circle kind of moment, and
it really was. And it was funny to have that happen, because I think back to my 18 or 20-year-old self, and it would be hard to believe in a way that I'd have a chance to work with these guys.
So what are you working on now, or what's next? And how have you been, like I know a lot of artists have been coping with this past year in different ways, but how have you been? How you been?
It's not. I'm not a big performer. I perform a lot at Akim Rodelius's festival in the summer, and that got canceled. But I'm kind of usually alone working in the studio anyway. I have to say this winter was tough. When COVID hit last year and spring was coming, I live in Northwest Ohio. So the summer didn't feel that bad. I wasn't going out to eat and stuff, but we had the whole outdoors and we could still make little day trips and all that stuff. But winter was tough because we're really closed in, it's too cold to really spend a lot of time outside, and there's nothing open and people aren't getting together and everything. So I really dove into work. I have a really wonderful project that of all the things that Akim and I never did, it was a piano record. There were a lot of little piano bits and things, but we made a record that is four-handed piano. It's him. It's him, and then on the same piano, he came here. We played a live show, and he came here in the middle of 2019, 2 years ago, and recorded a bunch of stuff that he wasn't sure what he was going to do with it. And I started playing around with it a little bit. And so we developed these things that didn't happen simultaneously, but I recorded him while he was here and then added these parts. And I'm not at liberty to say, but we have a really nice, good label for these. It'll probably be out in the fall. I'm really excited about it because solo piano records are so horrible for the most part. It's so hard to make a good one. I'm so tired of so much of that stuff because it's either so romantic. It just falls into people's habits of playing that all seem to be the same. But these are very different kinds of compositions, and playing to something, creating parts that work with his really freed up my own habits of piano playing. And I'm really excited about them. I think they're very, I think they're really kind of unique and beautiful. And we're really happy that we it looks like we're going to have a really nice release in the fall.
That's great.
So
that's something to look forward to for sure.
I'll let you know. You know when it happens, so I can tell you more about it. But also, a couple years ago, I've been, like Smudges, I've been really thinking a lot about how to recontextualize music, how to think about it in different ways, not just, normal composition techniques, but ways of presenting music that's different, that maybe makes people like interact with it in a different way. And one of the things was a few years ago, in conjunction with the Toledo Museum of Art, I made an audio installation using thousands of pieces of Akim Rodelius's piano. It's called the Rodelius Cells. And it's broadcast. I completely recomposed thousands of little bits of his piano recordings here that we made, for these other collaborations that we've released. But I had hours and hours of unreleased material that didn't really go anywhere, and I just started overlaying them into these really immersive, completely new compositions. And that has been, surprisingly to me a little bit, has been successful. It's had shows in Switzerland and Vienna and museums here. The biggest one was the Big Ears Festival in 2019, which is really a tough nut to crack.
That's a great fest.
Yeah, they're very influential, and it was installed there for the entire run of the festival. So that was really exciting. So the newest project is kind of a similar thing. I also worked with Mobius, the other half of Cluster, a lot. I produced the last Cluster album here at my house, with the two of them, and Moby and I and John Lydecker, who you and I talked about earlier, made a record in Montana, and Moby and I were also, we traveled a lot just for fun. My wife and I spent a week with him and his wife in Mallorca. But his music is so interesting and so different than mine. And he was such an important part of what Cluster was, with his really Fluxus Dada, sound design and just sense of humor. He passed away in 2015, incredibly sadly to us, but he left behind a huge amount of little bits and pieces, sounds, his loops and everything. And I'm in the process of working with Russ Curry right now, and we're developing another audio installation that is featuring sort of my reimaginings of his music. I'm working with his widow, Irene, in creating these things. But this time we're inviting other artists that have been influenced by him, in some cases that have played with him, to actually interact. After I recompose these parts, they interact with their own parts, and these will all be broadcast in a listening space on 8 separate channels, so that people can really hear the way these compositions were built. My Moby's original sounds, my arrangement of them, and then these interactions from other artists.
Oh, cool.
So we've been able to attract some, again, I can't really say yet because it's not announced, but we have some really great artists that have signed on with this. So that's what I really am diving into right now. But I've been sort of also dying to sort of start a new solo album that is a little bit of a throwback to the old days, using more piano and combinations with all the kind of experience and stuff that I have been doing for the last 20 years. So yeah, it's been part of the COVID thing for me is really, focused me on the stuff that I care about musically. And in some ways it certainly hasn't hurt, the drive to really just accept that I'm holed up here and make the most of it.
Yeah, I've been hearing that from a lot of, friends and musicians, and being like, well, just gives me a chance to like really dive into my practice and be in my studio. And I know other things that people have been doing is like digging into projects that maybe were like been put off for a long time or like low priority, you know, like I've been digging into my archives and trying to go through, you know, old music and just trying to make sense of everything and get it
Yeah. Oh my
organized, you
God.
know, all that
I
kind of stuff.
totally know. I know what you mean. And
Yeah.
I did last summer. I went into the basement and just started pulling up stuff, and I hadn't been able to talk to anybody in person. So I just started
Yeah.
putting these on Facebook and stuff like, here's an old master for this. And just had these wonderful interactions with people that, oh, I remember that one. Hey,
Yeah.
send, you know, it was really a great experience to just dive into the stuff that's in my little cocoon here
Yeah.
and kind of make sense of it, see where I came from. There was stuff in there that I had completely forgotten about, and I would post these things, and the two guys, that these journalists that have remained friends, would chime in, oh yeah, I remember that cassette, you sent me that. I mean, it's just sort of wonderful to take a deep breath and just take a minute out of all of this and kind of, you know, think about what got you to this point today, and you know, the good things and the not so good things. But it's not all bad. I hope we as a species can kind of learn from this and not just in a race to get back to normal. I hope that some of this stuff becomes our new normal, you know, being a little more retrospect about things, thinking a little more clearly about things, and maybe changing our lives maybe a little bit for the better, from things that might have been frustrating, but that people feel like, hey, maybe this was valuable after all.
Yeah, there's definitely stuff to be learned from it, and also I think the pandemic has exposed a lot of, you know, issues and problems, and I think those are things that we can, you know, kind of work on.
Absolutely. I mean, sometimes it takes a good crisis to make us realize some of the stuff that's broken and really does need to be as a society. I hope that, you know, as a world community, I hope that that's true. But yeah, I already see signs of it. That you talking about other artists that you taught. I saw this great comic. It's like the artist at work before COVID, and it's a guy, you know, alone in a little studio, and, you know, an artist at work during COVID, the same picture, and then artist at work after COVID. It's like all the panels are identical. And it's sort of true. I feel blessed in a way that my life hasn't been turned so upside down like so many other people who I can't imagine what they've gone through. I mean, I'm just lucky, amazingly lucky to have, I mean, music has been an important part of people's lives for the last year or so. You know, they haven't listened to my stuff any less. And, you know, it's just purely by luck that I haven't been like crushed like so many people have. And you have to take a minute to remember how many people that this has been truly, truly hard for. I can't complain a bit, you know.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I'm grateful and been able to, you know, make my way through it all, and, you know, not have a lot of terrible problems or anything. But well, anyway, Tim, it was great talking to you, man. And you know, I appreciate you chatting about your music and talking about Threads. And you know, I'm excited to hear these new projects that are coming out.
Great. I will keep in touch for sure. And thank you for this opportunity. I mean, it's great to be able to reach out, and I love what you're doing. I told you before that I think there's so much stuff. I mean, one of the blessings I had in the beginning was there were not many people making stuff because they couldn't, you know. Now there's just a glut of music out there, and very few ways of getting through it without listening to it all. So I really appreciate, you know, the kinds of things that you're doing of, you know, taking your lifelong love of music and just curating for people to give them a little guidance. Hey, I like this record, you know, have a listen to it. I think that's so important, maybe now more than ever. And of course, for your, I mean, you're not just a record store guy. You've made a lot of great music, and I really appreciate your questions coming from that direction too, because
Yeah,
you know pretty much my history because you
yeah.
lived it yourself.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. Yeah, thanks a lot. I appreciate that. And yeah, it's always, for me, it's like being able to do this is like almost like a little bit selfish because I get to just like talk to, musicians and friends, about music and things that I love. So it's always a pleasure to do it.
Great. Well, I was happy to do it, and it was a pleasure. It was a lot of fun. Thank you. Thanks for
Yeah.
giving me this opportunity too.
All right. Thanks, Tim. Take care.
Take care. You too. It was
Yeah.
a
Talk to you
pleasure.
later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.